I needed a break from everything: work, traffic, the endless noise of the city. I had been feeling drained for months, so when I finally got a long weekend off, I decided to get away. A cabin in the woods sounded perfect. Somewhere quiet with no distractions. Just me, nature, and some time to clear my head. I found a place online. It was deep in the woods, far from any town. Exactly what I wanted. The listing described it as rustic but well-kept, with no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and no neighbors for miles. That sounded perfect to me. The owner sent me detailed directions since GPS wouldn't work that deep in the forest. I packed my bag with enough supplies for a few days and set out early Friday morning. The drive started out normal. Highways turned into back roads, then narrower roads surrounded by dense trees. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I was on a gravel road. Then the gravel turned to dirt. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. No houses, no gas stations, no sign of people. Just endless trees pressing in on either side of the road. I followed the instructions carefully, taking slow turns where the owner had warned me about unmarked paths. After what felt like hours, I spotted the cabin at the end of a barely visible trail. It was small, with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof. A wraparound porch creaked as I stepped onto it. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Everything was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness. I brushed it off and unlocked the door. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch facing the fireplace, and a dusty bookshelf in the corner. The windows were small, letting in only a little light. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my bag by the couch and walked around. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. There were a few old hunting photos on the walls, a couple of shelves with random books, and a fireplace stacked with wood. I checked my phone. No signal as expected. That was fine. I wasn't here to scroll through my phone anyway. I took a deep breath and sat down, letting the silence settle over me. As the sun set, the cabin grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace and made a simple meal. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls. The quiet started to feel normal, even relaxing. I read for a while, then stretched out on the couch, listening to the crackling fire. For the first time in a long time, I felt calm. Then, late at night, I heard it. A soft noise outside. Faint, but distinct. Rustling leaves, like footsteps. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, everything was silent again. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the sound made me uneasy. It had been steady, deliberate, not the random scurrying of a small creature. I shook my head and went to bed, locking the door behind me. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, leaving the room dim. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping against the cabin wall. It was slow, deliberate, like fingers running along the wood. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. The glass reflected nothing but darkness. I waited, heart pounding. The sound stopped. For a long time, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any movement. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so paranoid. I stepped outside with my coffee, stretching. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The footprints didn't circle the cabin. They stopped near my bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been standing there, watching. I went back inside and locked the door. My mind raced. There were no other cabins nearby, no roads leading past mine. Who would be out here? I checked my phone again. Still no service. I considered leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe it was a hunter who had wandered too close. Maybe it was a prank. I forced myself to stay calm. The rest of the day was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked the locks. I kept the fire going, wanting as much light as possible. I sat on the couch, listening. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. Tap, light, hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. The window was small, the glass fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. Every creak, every shift of the fire made me jump. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. When the first light of morning came, I had already decided. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care about the money I had spent. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me all night. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road felt longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing, I will never go back to that cabin again. I had been looking for a quiet place to get away for a while. Life had been too noisy, work, the city, people. I wanted to be alone, just for a few days, somewhere peaceful, somewhere deep in nature where no one could reach me. I found a cabin listed online, far from any town, deep in the woods. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no distractions. Just me, the cabin, and silence. The drive was long. The further I went, the more the roads narrowed. Asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt. I passed a few scattered houses at first, then nothing. Just miles of trees on either side of the road. I followed the directions carefully, making sure I didn't miss any turns. The last stretch was barely a road at all, just a narrow trail with deep tire grooves winding through dense trees. It felt like I was going somewhere forgotten by the world. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly as I had expected. Small, weathered, with a slanted roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. The wood looked old but solid. The windows were small, the kind that barely let in any light. It sat alone at the end of the trail, surrounded by nothing but thick forest. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of people, nothing but trees and the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The air smelled fresh, earthy, untouched. But there was something else, something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. I expected birds, maybe the distant rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing, just complete stillness. I brushed it off. I had been in the city for too long. Maybe I just wasn't used to real silence anymore. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. The inside was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch facing the fireplace, a dusty bookshelf against one wall. It smelled like wood and age. The walls were lined with old hunting photos, black and white pictures of men holding up deer, rifles slung over their shoulders. A few shelves held random books, their covers faded with time. The first thing I did was check my phone. No service. I had expected that, but it still made me feel a little uneasy. It was strange knowing that if something happened, I had no way of calling for help. But I told myself that was the point of this trip. No distractions, just me and the quiet. I spent the rest of the evening settling in. I stacked the firewood left by the owner, started a small fire in the fireplace, and made a simple meal. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. I sat on the couch, listening to the silence. It was strange at first, unsettling, but I told myself I would get used to it. Then I heard something outside, faint rustling. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer. I shook my head, forcing myself to relax. I had been in the city for too long. My mind was just playing tricks on me. I went to bed, making sure to lock the door, though I doubted anyone was out here. Who would be this deep in the woods? I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, the room dim. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. Slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight, pointed it at the window, but the glass reflected nothing but the faint glow of the embers. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so on edge. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking in the fresh air. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The footprints didn't go all the way around the cabin. They stopped near my bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping. I went back inside and locked the door. My thoughts raced. Who would be out here? There were no roads past mine, no other cabins nearby. I checked my phone again. No service. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe just some local messing around. I forced myself to push the fear away. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked the locks, made sure the fire was big enough to last a while. I sat on the couch, listening. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it. Tap, light, hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. My hands gripped the armrest of the couch. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the fire made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things in record time, barely even stopping to eat. I didn't care if I had paid for another night. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, fresh ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. The road seemed longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I won't ever go back to that cabin again. I have always enjoyed the solitude of the wilderness. Being surrounded by nature, away from the noise of the city, has always given me a sense of peace. Over the years, I have taken many trips to remote cabins, places where I could spend days without seeing another person. There was something comforting about the isolation, about the quiet that only deep woods can offer. But one trip changed the way I looked at these getaways forever. I had found the cabin through an old map I bought at a flea market. It wasn't listed on any modern guidebooks, and I liked the idea of staying somewhere truly off the grid. The cabin was deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. I had to drive for hours along a rough, unpaved road just to reach the general area. From there, it was a 2-hour hike through dense forest to reach the place. The idea of being so far from everything excited me. Felt like a true escape. The hike in was exhausting. The trail was barely a trail at all. Just a faint path through the trees that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Fallen branches and overgrown brush made the walk slow and difficult. I had packed enough supplies to last a week, and my backpack weighed heavily on my shoulders. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant sounds of cars, no hum of civilization, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I wanted. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was small, made of weathered logs, with a slanted roof covered in moss. It looked abandoned but still sturdy. The door was unlocked, creaking on rusted hinges when I pushed it open. Inside, dust covered everything. There was a small wooden table, a chair, and a narrow cot against the wall. A fireplace sat in one corner, filled with old ashes. Shelves lined the walls, holding rusted tools, a few empty cans, and a lantern. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, unpacking my gear, and gathering firewood. As the sun set, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the cot, eating a simple meal. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of burning would made the place feel almost cozy. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, but inside, I felt safe. That feeling didn't last. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the walls. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I sat up, listening. The wind had died down, and the cabin was silent. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely there. A slow, deliberate creaking, like weight shifting on old wooden boards. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came from outside, near the front porch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was steady, deliberate, like someone was standing there. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam toward the door. Nothing. The sound had stopped. I waited, frozen, barely daring to breathe. Minutes passed. Then, just as I began to relax, something scraped against the door. A long, dragging sound, like nails or fingertips running across the wood. I gripped my knife tightly, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't move. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. Someone was outside, just inches away, waiting. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my muscles tense, my ears straining for any hint of movement. But after that last scrape, everything went silent again. I waited until the first light of dawn crept through the windows before I dared to move. When I finally opened the door, my stomach clenched. The ground outside was disturbed. The dirt and leaves shifted. Footprints, bare footprints. They led up to the door, circled the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. My skin crawled. Whoever had been there had walked barefoot in the freezing night all the way to my cabin. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things as quickly as possible, stuffing everything back into my bag. I wanted to be out of there before nightfall. As I stepped off the porch, I glanced at the footprints again. They weren't deep, but they were clear. A single set. Someone had come here alone. Someone who knew this cabin existed. Someone who had stood outside my door for hours. The hike back felt different. The woods no longer felt peaceful. Every snapped twig, every rustling branch made my pulse spike. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. But I never saw anything. The only proof that anything had happened was the set of footprints outside that cabin. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and drove away without looking back. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the land. Maybe it was something worse. Either way, I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had always wanted to spend time alone in a remote cabin. The idea of getting away from the constant noise of the city and the endless digital distractions seemed like a perfect break. When I found an old rental listing for a secluded cabin deep in the mountains, I booked it for a week without hesitation. The listing mentioned that the cabin was miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and only a small dirt road leading to it. That was exactly what I wanted, pure isolation. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up had been rough. The road was narrow and barely maintained, with potholes deep enough to rattle my truck. Thick trees lined both sides of the road, their branches arching over the path like they were closing in. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. It looked older than I expected, with weathered wood and a sagging porch. The place felt forgotten, like no one had been there in years. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine heavy around me. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant rush of a river. It was eerily quiet. The cabin was small but functional. A single room with a fireplace, a kitchenette, and a cot in the corner. The furniture was old, the wooden floor scuffed from years of use. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I found a cabinet with some basic supplies, canned food, matches, and a few old tools. The generator behind the cabin was still in working order, giving me enough power for the lights and a small heater. As night fell, I made a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. Occasionally, I heard something creak outside, but I told myself it was just the wind or some animal passing through. The first night was uneventful, though I woke up a few times to the sound of something moving outside. I told myself it was just the wind shifting the trees. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading further into the woods, so I followed it for a while. After about a mile, I found the remains of an old wooden structure, barely standing. It looked like another cabin, but much older, long abandoned. The roof had caved in, and most of the walls had collapsed. I stepped inside cautiously. The floor was covered in debris, rotting wood, broken furniture, and old, rusted tools. Something about the place felt off. There were deep scratches on the remaining walls, like something had clawed at them. I found old cans and a rusted-out stove, signs that someone had lived here long ago, but there were no signs of why they left. I felt a sudden urge to leave. I backed out of the structure and made my way quickly back to my cabin, glancing over my shoulder more than once. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The wind had died down, but the silence was worse. It made every small noise stand out. The creak of the wooden beams, the occasional rustle outside. Then I heard something distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. They circled the cabin, pausing at the front porch. The old wooden planks creaked under the weight. I reached for the knife I had brought with me, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed. Nothing. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. At first light, I stepped onto the porch. The ground was damp from the night air, and that's when I saw them, footprints in the mud. Not boot prints, bare feet. I scanned the tree line, but there was no sign of anyone. My gut told me to leave, but part of me wanted to believe it was just a hiker who had wandered too close. The third night, things escalated. I barricaded the door with a chair, just in case. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard breathing, close, right outside the cabin. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. I stayed completely still. My knife was in my hand, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knock came again. Then silence. I didn't move until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. When I finally dared to check outside, the footprints were back. They led from the woods, stopped at my door, then disappeared back into the trees. I had seen enough. I packed my things and loaded them into the truck as fast as I could. As I was about to leave, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chair I had used to barricade the door, it was moved. Not knocked over, not pushed aside, moved neatly to the other side of the room. I didn't waste another second. I got in my truck and drove out of there, the tires skidding on the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I will never stay in a remote cabin again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in an old cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I had rented the place online, Some old hunting cabin miles from the nearest road. Exactly what I wanted. A place where I could disconnect from everything. The drive took longer than expected. The last stretch was nothing more than a narrow dirt road winding through thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. The forest was dense, untouched. No cell service, no signs of other people. Just trees stretching in every direction. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place was small, built of dark, weathered wood, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. The forest pressed close against it, the trees blocking out most of the sky. There was a small clearing out front, just enough space to park my truck. The silence was absolute. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. There was a back door that led to a small storage shed, half buried in leaves. The only light came from a few oil lamps and the dying sunlight filtering through the trees. I unloaded my supplies, set up my gear, and lit a fire in the stove. As night fell, the air grew colder. I sat at the table eating a quick meal, listening to the sounds outside. The wind moving through the trees, the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. Normal sounds, nothing out of place. The first night I slept well. The thick logs of the cabin kept the cold out, and the fire burned low in the stove. I woke early, feeling rested. I made coffee, stepped outside, and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The forest was still and quiet. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking through the trees, following a small stream that ran near the cabin. I found old tracks in the mud, deer, maybe a bear. Nothing unusual, just the kind of solitude I had been looking for. That night, things started to feel different. I was sitting by the stove, reading, when I heard something outside. A soft, deliberate sound. Not the wind, not an animal moving through the brush. Footsteps, slow, steady. I sat still, listening. The steps stopped. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. Nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the trees. I checked the door, making sure it was locked, then went to bed. I lay awake for hours, listening. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind made my skin crawl. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Tracks in the dirt. Fresh tracks. Human. Leading from the trees to the cabin's front door. They didn't go anywhere else. Just from the woods to the porch. Then they stopped. I stood there, staring at them, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. Someone had been here, watching, standing just outside my door, and I had heard them. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing, just endless forest. I had no idea who it could have been. A hunter? A hiker who had gotten lost? But why wouldn't they knock? Why wouldn't they say anything? Why just stand there in the dark? I tried to shake it off, but all day, I couldn't relax. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The quiet that I had enjoyed the day before now felt oppressive, heavy. That night, I made sure the door was locked, wedging a chair under the handle just in case. I kept my hunting knife on the table next to me. The fire in the stove burned bright, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, filling the room with a dim orange glow. Then I heard it, a soft tapping, not at the door, at the window. I lay still, my heart pounding. The window was right next to the bed. The only thing separating me from whatever was outside was a thin pane of old glass. I turned my head slowly, straining my eyes in the darkness. Something moved. Just beyond the glass, a shadow shifted. I reached for the knife, gripping it so hard my hand ached. The tapping continued, light, rhythmic, deliberate. I forced myself to sit up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stared at the window, waiting for the next tap, but it never came. I don't know how long I sat there, knife in hand, staring at that window. But eventually, the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees. And just like that, the feeling was gone. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even make coffee. I just wanted to be gone. The second my truck's engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove straight home and never spoke about it to anyone. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to. I had been looking forward to the weekend at the cabin for weeks. Life had been exhausting. Work stress, city noise, the constant pressure of daily responsibilities. I needed the solitude, a few days away from people, just me and the quiet. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, an old hunting retreat deep in the woods. It hadn't been used in years, but he said it was still in decent shape. No running water, no electricity, but that didn't bother me. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive was long. The paved road eventually turned into a narrow dirt path, twisting through dense forest. It had rained recently, and the road was rough with mud and deep ruts. My truck struggled through a few spots, but I managed. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was smaller than I had expected. A simple wooden structure, dark from age, with a steep roof and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were intact but covered in grime. The door had a heavy iron latch, rusted but still solid. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. Dust floated in the dim light. The air smelled stale, a mix of old wood and dampness. There was a small table, a few chairs, and a single cot pushed against the far wall. A stone fireplace dominated one side of the room, filled with ash and bits of charred wood. I spent the first hour cleaning up. I swept out dead leaves and cobwebs, checked the walls for leaks, made sure no animals had moved in. Everything seemed fine, isolated but fine. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, unpacked my food and supplies, and got a small fire going in the fireplace. Outside, the forest was silent. No distant highway noise, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and let the warmth relax me. Then I heard something, a soft sound just outside the cabin. A faint crunching of leaves, slow and deliberate. My body tensed. I turned my head toward the window, but the glass was too dirty to see through clearly. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But something about the slowness of the steps felt off. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. I banked the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had died down, the cabin dimly lit by the last few glowing embers. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, right outside the cabin. I lay still, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The steps were slow, careful, moving along the side of the cabin. I strained to hear, barely breathing. Then, the sound of something brushing against the wooden walls. A faint, dragging sound. Not an animal. I reached for the hatchet I had brought with me and gripped it tightly. The footsteps stopped near the front door. A long pause. Then, a slight rattle of the latch. I froze. Someone was out there, testing the door. My truck keys were on the table, too far away to reach without making noise. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. After a moment, the latch stopped moving. The footsteps continued around the cabin, then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire with my hatchet in hand, every creak of the cabin sending shivers up my spine. At first light, I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything unusual. Near the back wall, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A single, deep scratch in the wood, like something had been dragged across it. I packed up immediately. I didn't care about breakfast. I threw my gear into the truck and started the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The drive back felt longer than before. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the trees behind me. But I never did. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was safely inside my apartment. I never told my friend what happened at his cabin. I never went back, and I never will. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin sounded like exactly what I needed. No phone calls, no emails, no responsibilities. Just me, nature, and the quiet. It wasn't my first time staying in a cabin, but it was the most isolated one I had ever chosen. Miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods with no neighbors in sight. That was the appeal. The drive took longer than expected. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then finally to dirt, winding deeper into the forest. My GPS lost signal halfway, but I had printed maps just in case. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. It was smaller than I expected, old but sturdy looking. A single-story structure with a covered porch, a woodpile stacked neatly to the side, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I stepped inside and took a look around. The inside was simple: wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and one bedroom with a twin bed pushed against the far wall. There was an old rocking chair in the corner, a thick layer of dust covering its seat. The air was stale, but after cracking a few windows, it started to feel better. I unpacked my things, making sure to set my flashlight, knife, and a small emergency radio on the nightstand. I knew how easy it was to get careless in a place like this. A twisted ankle, a wrong step outside, and I could be stranded for days before anyone noticed. I had told a friend where I was going, given them the location, and promised to check in when I got back. After setting up, I made a quick dinner, ate on the porch, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was heavier than I expected. No distant highway noise, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful. That night, I built a small fire in the fireplace, letting the warmth fill the cabin. The wood crackled, the light flickered against the walls. I read for a while, then decided to call it a night. The bed was old, the mattress thin, but I was exhausted. Sleep came fast. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The air was colder now. Then I heard it, something moving outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal. Too heavy, too precise. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin. Not close, but not far either. Just beyond the reach of the porch light. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. They stopped for a while, then started again. I gripped the knife beside me, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I waited, my body tense, until I couldn't hear anything but the wind. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning came with a strange sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest felt normal again. I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the isolation was getting to me faster than I expected. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking a few miles out, making sure I knew my surroundings. The woods were dense, the paths barely visible. Every so often, I would stop and listen, making sure I wasn't being followed. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, making sure the room stayed warm. Sleep came easier this time, but the footsteps came back. They were closer now, slower. I forced myself to stay still, my knife gripped in my hand. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They moved around the cabin, stopping every so often, listening, watching. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally stepped outside, I looked for tracks again. This time I found them. Boot prints, large, deep, leading from the tree-line to the edge of the porch, then back into the woods. Someone had been here, watching, listening. I locked the door behind me, checking the windows. Everything was secure, but it didn't matter. Someone had been outside all night, and I had no way of knowing if they would come back. I decided to leave early. I packed my things, checked my maps, and got ready to hike back to my car. But as I stepped onto the porch, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A single boot print, right at the foot of the steps, facing the door. I hadn't heard them approach. They had been standing there, just feet away from where I slept, watching, waiting. I didn't waste another second. I left everything but my essentials moving fast through the trees. Every so often, I looked back, expecting to see someone following, but there was nothing. I reached my car, breathless, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The moment the engine roared to life, I tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. The cabin is still there, probably just as I left it. But I know I wasn't alone that night. Someone had been watching me, and they had been waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Work had drained me, and I needed some time away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no people. Just me, the quiet, and a cabin deep in the woods. I had found it online, a small old place sitting near the base of a mountain, surrounded by thick forest. It was isolated, exactly what I wanted. The drive was long, taking me through miles of empty roads. As I got closer, the road turned into a narrow dirt path winding through dense trees. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was leaving civilization behind. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the mountains. The place looked just like the pictures, old but sturdy. A single-story structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a chimney sticking out one side. The forest pressed in close, thick and dark, almost too close. I parked my truck, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The cabin smelled like wood and dust. It had a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old fireplace. There was no electricity, only gas lamps and a wood stove. That was fine, I had planned for that. I set my supplies down, checked the doors and windows, then started a fire in the stove. As the cabin warmed up, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. After eating a simple meal, I stepped outside to take in the quiet. The air was crisp. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest was too still, too silent. It wasn't normal. There should have been the sounds of birds, the distant calls of animals. But there was nothing, just an unnatural quiet pressing in from all sides. I shook it off and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I read for a while by lantern light, then turned in for the night. Sleep came fast, but it didn't last. Something woke me up. A noise, faint but distinct. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. It had been a soft scrape, like something moving outside against the wooden walls. Then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stayed awake for a long time before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the door. Someone had been here, standing outside in the dark, watching me. I scanned the trees, my skin crawling. The tracks led back into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I had seen no other cabins, no roads leading here. Whoever it was, they had come a long way just to stand outside my cabin in the night. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe they had been looking for shelter. But if that was the case, why hadn't they knocked? Why just stand there? I spent the day gathering wood, checking the area, making sure everything was in place. but that feeling of being watched never left. As the sun set, I double-checked the locks and loaded the old hunting rifle I had brought with me, just in case. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the same sound, a slow, dragging scrape against the cabin wall, then a soft tap at the window. My blood turned to ice. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't dare move. Finally, the sound stopped. At dawn, I checked outside again. More footprints. More evidence that someone had been there, circling, watching. I couldn't stay here. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and left. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty forest and the fading outline of the cabin. I never found out who it was, and I don't want to know. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A cabin deep in the woods, far away from everything. No emails, no calls, no responsibilities, just silence and solitude. I found the listing online, a small rental tucked away in a forested area about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures made it look perfect. A cozy wooden structure, surrounded by thick trees, with a small lake nearby. The owner's description mentioned it was off-grid, meaning no electricity or running water. But that didn't bother me. I wanted the isolation. The drive out was peaceful. Once I left the main highway, I followed a winding road through dense forest, the kind of place where you rarely see another car. The directions the owner had given me were precise, and soon I turned onto an unpaved road, barely wide enough for my vehicle. It was rough with deep grooves and rocks, forcing me to go slow. Eventually, I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was just like the pictures, maybe even better. A simple log cabin with a front porch, surrounded by towering pines. The lake was visible through the trees, its surface smooth and untouched. No neighbors, no roads, no signs of people. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. The air was fresh, the kind of crisp scent that only exists far from the city. The inside of the cabin was small but comfortable. A single room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a few shelves with basic supplies. A stack of firewood was neatly piled against one wall. I had brought my own supplies, canned food, water, a flashlight, and extra batteries. There was a small outhouse behind the cabin, just a wooden structure over a pit. Everything felt perfect. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking, and gathering extra firewood. As evening came, I started a fire in the stove and made a simple meal. Outside, the forest grew darker, the trees blending into a wall of black. I sat on the porch for a while, listening. The sounds of the woods were different from the city. No distant traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, and the soft lapping of water against the shore. It wasn't until I went back inside that I noticed something strange. The door didn't lock properly. There was a latch, but it seemed flimsy, like it had been repaired multiple times. I tested it a few times, making sure it would hold. It wasn't great, but I figured it was fine. Who else would be out here? That night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. Everything was silent, too silent. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My pulse pounded in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew better. These were human footsteps, steady, purposeful. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps circled the cabin, then stopped near the front porch. My mind raced. The door, the weak latch. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I stayed awake for hours, waiting, listening, but they didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning brought a sense of relief. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cool air. Everything looked normal. No signs of disturbance, no footprints. Had I imagined it? I spent the day exploring, hiking along the lake's edge, trying to shake the unease. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. By evening, I felt calmer. I made dinner, read for a while by flashlight, then crawled into bed. The second night was worse. I woke up to a noise. Not footsteps this time, something scraping against the wood. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the cabin's wall. My stomach twisted. I sat up, heart hammering, gripping my flashlight. The scraping moved, circling the cabin. I wanted to check, to shine my light outside, but fear kept me frozen. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock on the door. Just once. Not forceful, not urgent. Just a tap, like someone letting me know they were there. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into my bag, constantly glancing at the door. When I stepped outside, the forest was silent. Too silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I locked the cabin. Not that it mattered, and hurried to my car. The drive back felt endless. The rough road, the twisting turns. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. But there was nothing. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I drove straight home, not stopping once. I never contacted the cabin owner, never left a review. I didn't want to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that single knock. I had been planning this cabin trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise of everyday life, clear my head, and spend a few nights alone in the wilderness. I picked a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from the usual tourist spots. I wanted complete isolation, just me and nature. I packed all the essentials: food, water, flashlight, knife, and a small axe. I even brought a notebook, thinking I might jot down some thoughts while sitting by the fireplace at night. The drive to the cabin was tougher than I expected. The narrow dirt road leading up to it was barely visible under fallen leaves and overgrown bushes. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, and it showed. The wooden structure looked aged but sturdy, with a slanted roof covered in moss. The windows were coated in a layer of dust, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the front door. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and old fabric. A single-room layout greeted me. A small kitchen area, a wooden table, a stone fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. It was simple, exactly what I wanted. I opened a few windows to let in fresh air and started unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Occasionally, a gust of wind would rattle the branches outside, but it was peaceful. I went to bed early, letting the quiet surround me. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small trail behind it, leading deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, stepping carefully over fallen branches and damp earth. I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed and covered in vines. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched. The thought stuck with me as I turned back toward the cabin. That night, as I sat by the fire, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking toward the windows, expecting to see movement in the darkness beyond. The woods seemed different at night. Shadows stretched in unnatural ways. Tree branches swayed even when there was no wind. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light across the cabin. I listened, straining to hear beyond the normal creaks of the wooden walls. Then I caught its soft, deliberate footsteps just outside the cabin. My heart pounded. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped near the porch. It wasn't an animal. Animals move erratically, but this was different. This was controlled, purposeful. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The wooden floor was cold beneath my bare feet as I slowly stood up. The footsteps started again, moving along the side of the cabin. My breath was shallow, my body tense. I stepped toward the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps stopped again, right outside the entrance. I stared at the thin wooden barrier separating me from whoever or whatever was on the other side. I wanted to open it, to look, but my instincts screamed at me to stay still. Minutes passed. The silence was unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally allowing myself to breathe again. The next morning, I searched the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, nothing to indicate that someone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. It hadn't been a dream. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself that if something had wanted to harm me, it would have done so last night. I convinced myself to stay one more night. That day, I stuck close to the cabin, keeping my knife within reach at all times. As the sun began to set, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat with my back against the wall, my ears tuned to every sound. It happened again that night. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin just like before. But this time, they didn't stop at the entrance. They moved closer to the windows, then back toward the trees. I could hear slow, deliberate breathing, deep, steady inhales and exhales. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay another night. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The drive back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling branch sent a wave of fear through me. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But I never did. When I finally reached home, I locked the doors behind me and sat in silence. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. And I know, without a doubt, that I was not alone in those woods. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization, away from everything. I wanted complete solitude, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had rented a small hunting cabin, miles away from any roads or towns. It was old but sturdy, with a wood-burning stove, a small bed, and a storage area for supplies. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. The drive to the closest parking area was long, miles of winding dirt roads. I parked in a clearing, locked up my truck, and checked my pack. I had all my gear, food, water, warm clothing, a rifle, and enough supplies for a week. The hike to the cabin was about 5 miles through dense forest, with no marked trails. I had a map and compass, but I had studied the area enough to navigate without much trouble. The first few miles were peaceful. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were my boots crunching on leaves and the distant calls of birds. No signs of people, no signs of anything unusual, just the way I wanted it. When I reached the cabin, it looked just as I expected, small, weathered, isolated. There was a stack of firewood against the side, likely left by the last person who stayed here. The door was locked, just as the owner had said it would be. I pulled out the key, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched for weeks, maybe months. Dust covered the wooden floor, and a few cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I set down my pack, stretched, and started setting up. I checked the small wood stove, making sure it was still in working order. The chimney was clear. I stacked some wood inside, ready for the night. The single window had a wooden shutter that could be latched from the inside. It wasn't much, but it would keep the wind out. By late afternoon, I had settled in. I chopped some more firewood, made a simple meal, and sat outside watching the trees. The silence was almost too much. No distant cars, no voices, just the wind through the branches. It was peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, I lit a fire, ate, and locked up. The inside of the cabin was warm, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I lay in bed, I listened to the woods. At first, just the usual sounds: wind, creaking trees, the occasional rustle in the bushes. But then something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. No knocking, no attempt to open the door. Just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. To first light, I stepped outside. No signs of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. I spent the day checking the area. I walked a half-mile in each direction, looking for signs of a campsite or another cabin. Nothing. Just endless trees. That evening, I locked up again, kept my rifle close, and waited. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still. Then, just as before, they faded into the distance. At sunrise, I packed up. I wasn't going to wait around to see who it was or what they wanted. I left nothing behind, locked up the cabin, and started hiking back. Halfway to my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, fresh, leading away from the direction of the cabin. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop moving. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was just a hunter. Maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't about to find out. Some places are better left alone. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just quiet. That was the plan. I had rented the cabin from a small listing I found online. It was old, simple, and far from any major roads. It had been used mostly as a hunting cabin, according to the description. There was a single dirt path leading to it, barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was rough, the road uneven, potholes filled with water from recent rain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked like something from an old photograph. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a tin roof. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no noise except for the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I liked it. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and there was a bathroom with an old shower that barely worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and started a fire in the old wood stove. The temperature had dropped fast, and the warmth was welcome. I made a quick meal, ate at the table, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the woods darken. The trees were so thick that once the sun was gone, it felt like the world ended just beyond the cabin's small clearing. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside made the trees creak. I woke up a few times, feeling like something had disturbed me, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. At some point, I fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died, and the air inside was cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to gather some firewood. The The cabin had a small shed a few yards away, stocked with dry logs. As I walked over, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the front door. Then they turned and went back into the trees. They were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, maybe wearing boots. My own tracks from the day before were still visible, but these were new. I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out here. I had heard nothing during the night. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. It wasn't the kind of place you just wandered through by accident. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. That made sense. Still, I felt unsettled. I brought the firewood inside, lit the stove again, and made some coffee. The warmth helped, but the thought of those footprints stuck with me. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, exploring a little. The woods were dense, but I found an old overgrown trail that seemed to lead somewhere deeper. I followed it for a while before turning back, not wanting to go too far from the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was already starting to set. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it felt different, heavy, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I woke up again, but this time I knew why. There was a sound outside. Slow, steady footsteps moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried, not like an animal moving through the underbrush. They were deliberate, careful. They stopped near the porch. Then silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tightly. I listened, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was messing with my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The footprints were there again, fresh. They circled the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around it, stopping at the windows, the door, watching. I decided to leave. Whatever peaceful trip I had planned was over. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. As I loaded my things into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt something there, watching. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of that forest, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, I couldn't shake it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who had been there. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I needed a break from everything. Work, the noise of the city, the constant rush of life. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a week. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, a place where I could clear my head. I had been to remote cabins before, but never one this isolated. That was part of the appeal. The drive took almost 5 hours. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. Trees lined both sides, thick and tall, blocking most of the sunlight. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of dark wood with a slanted roof. It had a small front porch, a single window facing the woods, and a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I parked my car a few feet away, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood. There was a small kitchen, a single bed, a fireplace, and a wooden table with a chair. It was simple, but that was all I needed. I dropped my bag on the floor and started unpacking. By the time I finished, the sun was already setting. The forest outside grew darker, the trees turning into black shapes against the dimming sky. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down, listening to the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It felt good to be away from everything. At some point, I heard something outside. a rustling sound, like someone or something moving through the trees. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. I ignored it and went back to staring at the fire. But the noise didn't stop. It was slow, steady, circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening. After a while, the sound faded. I told myself it was nothing. The woods were full of animals. There was no reason to be afraid. Still, I made sure the door was locked before going to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the room. Something felt off. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a soft creaking sound, like weight shifting on the wooden porch. My heart started pounding. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, but I didn't turn it on. I just lay there, waiting. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I wanted to get up, to check the window, but I couldn't move. I just listened. The creaking stopped. Then, a soft scraping sound against the wood, like fingers running over the surface of the door. I gripped the flashlight so tight my hand hurt. My mind raced. Who would be out here? The nearest town was miles away. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. The scraping stopped. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard footsteps moving away from the cabin. Slow at first, then faster, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening, waiting for the sound to return. Didn't. When the sun finally rose, I got up and checked outside. There were no footprints on the porch, no signs that anyone had been there, but I knew what I heard. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see something in the trees. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest. That night, I locked the door and kept the flashlight in my hand. I didn't light a fire. I wanted to be able to hear everything. Hours passed. Then, just like the night before, I heard it again. The soft creaking of the porch. The slow scrape of fingers against wood. I didn't move. I just gripped the flashlight, heart pounding. The sound lasted longer this time. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. Then, a new sound. The doorknob rattling. Not hard, not enough to break it, just testing. My breath caught in my throat. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then a whisper. Too low to understand. Just a breath of sound against the wood. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body locked. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. The footsteps retreated again, disappearing into the woods. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to my car. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away from that place. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that cabin. I had always wanted to spend some time alone in a cabin, away from everything. Life had been stressful and I needed a break. A friend of mine had mentioned an old family-owned cabin deep in the woods that wasn't used anymore. He told me I could stay there for a few days if I wanted. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had electricity, running water, and enough supplies to last a while. It seemed perfect. The drive was long. The paved roads turned into dirt ones, and eventually, I had to park my car and hike the last stretch. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. It looked old but solid, with thick wooden walls and a simple porch out front. There were no neighbors, no signs of people for miles. Exactly what I wanted. The inside was basic but comfortable. A fireplace, a small kitchen, an old wooden table, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. The windows were covered in dust. The air smelled like wood and age. There was a radio, but no phone signal. I didn't mind. I had brought books, food, and enough to keep me busy. The first day was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listened to the wind in the trees, and felt my stress melt away. I cooked a simple meal, read for a while, and went to bed early. The quiet was soothing. The first night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stayed still, listening. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. I turned over, tried to ignore it, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. Not animal tracks. Human. They weren't mine. They circled the cabin, stopping just below the windows. My stomach tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin was miles away from any main road, and I hadn't seen a single person on the way in. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here before, maybe a hunter or hiker. The ground was dry, the prints could have been from days ago, but they looked fresh. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake the unease. The woods were dense, stretching endlessly in every direction. I found an old shed behind the cabin, mostly empty except for rusted tools and a pile of firewood. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch movement in the trees. Just shadows, I told myself. Just the wind. That night, I locked the doors and windows before going to bed. I kept the fire low, listened to the crackling, and tried to push my thoughts away. But I couldn't sleep. Hours passed, and I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too steady, too human. They stopped right outside the window. I stayed completely still. The air felt heavy. Then I heard a soft sound. The doorknob turning. Not rattling, not forced, just a slow, quiet turn. Whoever it was, they were trying to be careful. The door was locked, but I knew that wouldn't matter if they really wanted to get in. My mind raced. I had a knife in the kitchen, a fire poker near the fireplace, but I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, stretched endlessly. Then the footsteps moved again, slowly, around the cabin, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing. But the footprints were there, fresh ones, leading from the woods, circling the cabin, stopping at the door. I packed my things, fast. I didn't care how peaceful the place was supposed to be. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just trees, silence, and that unbearable feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and drove until I was back on paved roads. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never told my friend what happened. I just thanked him for letting me use the cabin and made up some excuse about cutting the trip short. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know someone was out there. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for months. I needed the break. Life had been stressful, and the thought of spending a few days alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods felt like the perfect escape. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. I had booked the place through a small rental site, run by a local who barely advertised it. That was part of the appeal. The drive was long, taking me far from any major town. The roads became narrower, winding through thick forest until eventually, I was on a dirt path that barely looked used. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, but I had printed directions just in case. The last stretch of road was rough, with potholes and tree roots pushing through the ground. Finally, I saw the cabin. A small wooden structure, simple but sturdy, sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, the silence deep. No traffic, no distant hum of civilization. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was exactly as described. One room with a small kitchen, a fireplace, a bed against the far wall, and a bathroom with an old but functional shower. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a wood-burning stove. That was fine. I had packed everything I needed: food, extra blankets, even a book or two for the evenings. I spent the first couple of hours settling in, unpacking my bag, and checking the place out. The only sign of other people was a small stack of firewood left by the owner, neatly arranged under the overhang of the porch. I appreciated that. It meant I wouldn't have to go looking for dry wood right away. I started a fire in the stove, making the cabin warm and comfortable as the sun started to set. That first night was peaceful. The fire crackled softly, and I sat on the small wooden chair near the window, sipping hot tea and enjoying the quiet. The darkness outside was absolute. No streetlights, no distant glow from a town, just blackness beyond the trees. I felt safe inside, though. The thick logs of the cabin felt solid, protective. I slept well. The bed was old but comfortable, and the warmth from the stove kept the chill away. I woke up early, made a simple breakfast, and decided to explore the area. There were no marked trails, but I had brought a map and compass. I walked through the woods, following no particular path, just enjoying the fresh air and the solitude. A few hours in, I noticed something strange. A boot print in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was bigger, deeper. Someone else had been here recently. I stood still, listening. The forest was quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze passed through. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Still, the print unsettled me. I wasn't expecting to run into anyone out here. The owner had told me the cabin was rarely rented, and there were no other homes or camps nearby. I kept walking but stayed more alert. Every snapping twig, every shifting shadow put me on edge. After another hour, I turned back. I had seen enough for one day. Back at the cabin, I locked the door behind me. It felt unnecessary, but the sight of that footprint had left a feeling I couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the day close to the cabin, gathering more firewood and making a simple meal. As the sun set, I felt more uneasy than before. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, as I was preparing to go to bed, I heard it. A sound outside, a soft crunch of leaves. I froze. For a moment, I held my breath, listening. The sound didn't come again, but my heart was pounding. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited for several minutes before stepping back. Maybe it was an animal. That had to be it. I went to bed but didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me tense. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. In the morning, I stepped outside, scanning the ground around the cabin. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set, two. They circled the cabin, stopping near the window where I had been last night. Someone had been watching me. I felt sick. This wasn't just some lost hiker. Someone had come close. Someone had stood outside my cabin while I slept. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside without bothering to organize it, and locked the cabin behind me. My truck was still there, untouched. I got in, started the engine, and left without looking back. The drive back felt longer. Every mile put more distance between me and whatever or whoever had been out there. When I got home, I emailed the cabin owner, telling him what happened. He responded quickly, saying no one else had rented the place in months. He seemed concerned but had no answers. I haven't gone back. I love the wilderness, but I won't stay in a remote cabin alone again. Some places are better left undisturbed. I always loved getting away from everything, just shutting out the world for a few days. That was why I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, far from people, far from anything. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to relax and disconnect. But looking back, I wish I had never gone there. The cabin was old but solid. It was a one-room structure with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The wooden floors creaked under my boots when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and would smoke. There was no electricity, just a few old gas lamps hanging from the walls. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my gear, set up a small fire outside, and made some food. The quiet was almost too much at first. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating, watching the sky darken. When the cold started creeping in, I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something felt off. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the air inside the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. I listened for a while, but all I could hear was the wind outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They were deep, heavy prints, not the light tracks of an animal. Someone had been there, walking around while I slept. I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was probably just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. That was possible, right? That night, I locked the door and set a chair against it. I kept my knife next to me, barely sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. The wind against the windows, the crackling of cooling wood. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped my knife, staying as still as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Whoever was out there was standing just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed. Then, just as silently as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I never found out who was out there that night. I never went back to that cabin. Some places are meant to be left alone. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. I needed time away from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city. The thought of being completely alone in nature with no distractions sounded perfect. I found a place online, an old but well-maintained cabin that was far from any town, surrounded by nothing but forest. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet. The drive out was long. The roads got narrower the further I went, turning from paved to gravel, then finally to dirt. The last stretch had no signs, just a winding path through thick trees. I followed the directions carefully and eventually spotted the cabin, sitting alone at the end of the trail. It was small, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, but everything looked sturdy. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my bags. The air smelled fresh, the way only deep woods can. Everything was still and quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No wind through the trees, just an eerie silence. I brushed it off and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The place was simple, one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a dusty bookshelf, and a single couch facing the fireplace. The windows were small, and the only light came from the dim bulbs powered by a generator. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I set my bags down and walked around, getting a feel for the place. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. The walls had old hunting photos and a few shelves with random books. The bed was small but looked comfortable enough. I checked my phone, no service. I expected that. The rental listing had warned about it. I took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, letting the silence settle in. It felt strange at first, but I told myself I would get used to it. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace, using the stack of wood left by the owner. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls. I made a simple meal, ate by the fire, then stretched out on the couch with a book. The stillness of the place was almost soothing now. No emails, no traffic noise, just the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wood. Then I heard something outside, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, But beyond that, everything was still. I shook my head and went back to my book, convincing myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. When I went to bed, I made sure the door was locked, though I doubted anyone was out there. Who would be this deep in the woods? I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. It was slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass reflected nothing but the faint glow of the embers. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so on edge. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking in the fresh air. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The footprints didn't go all the way around the cabin. They stopped near the bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping, close enough to touch the walls. I looked back at the footprints, trying to judge their size. They were normal, too normal. Not boots, not hiking shoes. Just regular footprints, like someone had been walking barefoot. I went back inside and locked the door. My thoughts raced. Who would be out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no roads leading anywhere past mine. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe some local had wandered by. Maybe it was a prank. I forced myself to push the fear away. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked all the locks and made sure the fire was big enough to last a while. I sat on the couch, listening. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it. Tap. Light, almost hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. My hands gripped the armrest of the couch. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the fire made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things in record time, barely even stopping to eat. I didn't care if I had paid for another night. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something that made my breath catch. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, fresh ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. The road seemed longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I won't ever go back to that cabin again.